Thanks for listening to the Granite List Live. Today's episode is brought to you by Connect Healthcare Collaboration, where benefits marketing meets clinical advocacy to drive effective employee engagement. This is the Granite List Live, where we explore all things human capital and employee benefits related. I'm your host, Sally Pace, and today I'm joined by Zach Fiedler and Jake Gall with the Prism Health Group. Guys, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us, Sally.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here. And I'm going to ask you, Zach, to kind of kick it off and give us an overview of the company. What is the Prism Health Group?
Absolutely, yeah. And maybe first a little bit about myself. So I serve as Chief Operating Officer for the Prism Health Group, and I've spent majority of my career in the PBM, pharmacy benefit management space. I've worked for various consulting firms as well as directly with the PBM. A lot of focus on technology, claims data, and operations. So the Prism Health Group itself, we are a pharmacy benefit consulting company, and we work with plan sponsors and payers of all types to manage their prescription drug benefit. And a big part of how we do this is we provide PBM contract management support, ongoing reporting and monitoring, and audit and reconciliation services. And our team overall consists of consultants, analysts, and clinicians who are all long-term experts in the pharmacy benefit space. And I'd just say our goal here is to provide optimization and savings opportunities for our clients so that they all have the peace of mind that they're providing the best benefits to their members.
Awesome. And given the nature of the work that you all do, you spend a lot of time looking at two of the favorite industry words, spend and trend. Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing?
Absolutely. And I'd say the biggest reasons we kind of develop the spend and trend report and look at this is, first off, data is at the foundation of everything we do. So we pull this spend and trend report together. Primarily, we want to show and display the importance of data and different ways that we utilize data on behalf of our clients to show insights and recommendations. Secondarily, we look at this to combine our knowledge and information across our book of business so that we can show market level trends and overall industry benchmarks that really anybody can leverage. And maybe a few specifics too about the report. Again, our report does leverage data across our book of business, and it is isolated to the commercial line of business. We really want this to be consistent to our market messaging within the commercial space. And most of our figures and metrics that you'll see throughout the report as well, it leverages point of sale cost basis. So while we do have some insights in our report that leverages industry rebate data and values, this data, as many know, is not readily available and consistent with how we receive claims data. So our primary focus is on the ingredient cost basis.
Can you kind of paint a picture for who you're sending this information to? Is it the broker community, the employer community, TPAs? Who are you working alongside?
Yeah, great question. I'd say biggest target kind of primarily is going to be any type of plan sponsor, whether you're an employer, payer of benefits. This type of information is going to be very knowledgeable, very useful to understand where the market's at. So many plan sponsors and payers will utilize this information to benchmark against how their plan is doing and to understand if they are seeing similar trends within their patient population as we see in the market.
So do those different audiences have different goals as they're interacting with you, looking at spend and trend?
They absolutely may. I mean, I think there's certain areas where if an employer or a plan sponsor sees trends within their population that is different than the book of business, I think that can be a specific area to isolate and to dig in further and to look at different opportunities for management.
Yes. In addition to spend and trend, what are some of the insights that you all are looking at and KPIs that you can share with the audience?
Absolutely. And you know, one of the things we saw in looking at last year's trend is really a pivotal shift over what we've seen probably in the last decade or more, as we've consistently seen specialty drugs being the primary driver of trend, and non-specialty drugs would remain relatively flat. So what we saw last year is a consistent trend in specialties, so that remained in the double digits at about 15%, almost entirely driven by utilization increases. But the one thing we saw different last year for the first time is non-specialty trend surpassed specialty at a rate of 23% increase. So this makes the overall net trend that we saw across our book near 20%, which is a pretty significant increase over many years. And a lot of this, you're going to hear us talk a lot about, is the expanding access and coverage of GLP-1 and weight loss medications. So this is a major contributor, the major component. And I'd also point out, this is likely something that's unique about our report, is that our trend report does not exclude any of these categories or any of these drugs. And something to pay attention to with other trend reports that you may see in the market, they may exclude these categories as to not inflate trend, but we believe it's important to include this. This is something that plan sponsors and payers are significantly impacted by, and we want to make sure we show the impact it has.
Absolutely. Transparency is one of your big hallmarks, and that's evident in the report as well. Well, you kind of teed it up to pass the ball to Jake. Jake, before you dive in to the very interesting world of GLP-1s, do you mind giving us a little bit of your background?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for having us today. Jake Gall, I'm a clinical pharmacist by trade, but hung up the white coat about 6 years ago now to join the PBM side, and recently joined Prism about a year ago to provide some clinical insights for them, but largely responsible for formulary overview as well as clinical program insight, and doing that deep dive at the claim level just to see what's really driving that individual drug trend and how we can fine-tune our formularies or plan design to kind of address that. As was mentioned, GLP-1s and I think biosimilars were the two big hot topics in 2024. Going back to what Zach kind of said about the trend in spend and how specialty kind of stayed level and our non-specialty started to increase, I think those two categories can really give us a good idea as to the background there as to why that happened.
So help peel back the layers. Talk a little bit about, let's start with GLP-1s and what you're seeing there.
So with the GLP-1s, you kind of have to bucket those in two separate categories. You have the ones that are approved for type 2 diabetes. So those are like your Ozempics and Mounjaros. And then you have the separate category, which is the weight loss ones. So you're thinking your Wegovy and your Zepbound. The majority of plans do cover these for type 2 diabetes now, and there's a lot of clinical evidence that supports that. It does a fantastic job at lowering the blood sugar. And on top of that, it does provide weight loss, no secret there. And it's shown to have some cardiovascular and kidney protective effects as well, which are really important for diabetes. So we continue to see the trend upward there as well for the diabetes diagnosis, but weight loss in particular is really where it's exploded. And that's also a tricky kind of category as well because you're not seeing all plans cover it for weight loss. It's a much smaller set that are actually going to cover these weight loss GLP-1s. And coupled with that, on the weight loss side, we did see 2 new FDA approvals for these products in 2024 as well. So Wegovy received approval to reduce the risk of major cardiovascular events in individuals with cardiovascular disease and obesity. And then Zepbound at the very end of the year in December received approval for obstructive sleep apnea in adults with obesity. So as the year went on, we start to see more and more basically diagnoses that these can be used for, which on top of just their popularity in social media is really what's driving the utilization there.
And so are you seeing those other disease state specific applications, employers kind of honing in on that? Do employers care about sleep apnea?
So that's an interesting topic you can dive a bit deeper into as well, because you really have to read into the FDA labeling there. Because the first part is, yes, it's approved for sleep apnea, but specifically in adults with obesity. So it makes you kind of think about, well, okay, what's driving that sleep apnea? And it's no secret that sleep apnea is very closely tied to obesity or being overweight. So with that, we've seen that PBMs have given employer groups and plan sponsors some flexibility there to say whether they want to cover for these new indications. Just anecdotally speaking, we tend to see the plans that don't already cover for weight loss, they're not adding these new indications to coverage as well.
And do you see any future trends as we look at or we hear about going from an injection to a pill? Anything that you're thinking top of mind there?
Yeah, so very early data out and actually anticipating more data soon on Eli Lilly's pill version of the drug. So something we definitely want to keep our eyes on in 2025. But in addition to that, just looking at the products that are already on the market, anticipating to see some more approvals added in 2025. So particularly with Zepbound, we're going to see that potentially approved for a specific form of heart failure called heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. And then Wegovy is slated for potential approval for a type of liver disease. It comes with a number of acronyms, but most frequently referred to as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, so showing a lot of benefits there. So could potentially see 2 or more new approvals in 2025. And then, like I had mentioned too, very soon we expect to see some data on that Eli Lilly pill version of a drug.
Can we flash back to what was it like 2022, 23 when Humira came raging into the scene or was on, advertised every 30 minutes on TV? Can you talk about the shift that's taking place there?
Yeah, so 2024 was kind of the first year where we did start to see more of a significant shift towards preferring the biosimilars and working towards getting Humira off formulary. And as you had mentioned, kind of 2022, 2023, when we started to see those Humira biosimilars come out, but there were a lot of tricky issues at the beginning, such as bundled rebates and whatnot, that made it difficult to remove Humira from formulary and prefer those biosimilars. That was a major shift that we saw in 2024. And so with that, as Zach had mentioned, our specialty trends there stayed. We didn't see many huge differences, I guess, from previous years. And we're having that non-specialty trend start to take over now. What's potentially maybe slowing or leveling out that specialty trend a little bit is the transition to those Humira biosimilars.
Are those the related products like the new catchy ads for Skyrizi and Tremfya? We all can hear their jingles in our head.
Yeah.
What about, we mentioned early on, specialty generics. Can you paint a picture for what you're seeing there?
Yeah, specialty generics have been a particularly hot topic. I would say really picking up steam in January of 2025 this year. The Federal Trade Commission's report that came out kind of doing a deep dive into the data with the big 3 or big 6 PBMs, kind of showing how these specialty generics were having some fairly significant markups over their acquisition costs, particularly when dispensed through the PBM specialty pharmacy. Prism did a deep dive of our own data to kind of see how they benchmarked against NADAC, which is an average drug cost benchmark. And that just served as kind of a good baseline to see generally whether you're kind of close to what the acquisition cost is or what a pharmacy is typically paying for these. And Prism saw that probably about 2,600% average markup on some of these specialty generic products over that acquisition cost, which kind of highlights, especially with all of these, fiduciary duty lawsuits that we're starting to see crop up. It's kind of encouraging us to look a lot closer at these specialty generic drugs and kind of seeing how the contract accounts for these. Do we need to maybe move more towards an acquisition cost model, or maybe we need to more closely manage the MAC or maximum allowable cost list with these specialty generics? But I think that's going to be a hot topic in the future as well, as more and more specialty generics starting to hit the market in 2025.
Well, and I want to kind of wrap with that because you've talked about specialty generics, this other phrase that we're starting to hear more of, high impact generics. Can you explain to the audience what that is and kind of what that process looks like for bringing those into the market?
Yeah, so that term is kind of catching some of these it's a catch-all for these like high utilization, high cost brand products that are currently really popular on the market. Just to name a few, you think of like Xeljanz for the inflammatory conditions or rheumatoid arthritis. Think of Januvia for type 2 diabetes, or Sprycel, which is a popular cancer medication. These are all incredibly high-cost drugs as brand products, and they tend to have higher utilization just because of the disease states that they treat and their overall popularity among patients and prescribers. And so that's kind of why there's more of a higher impact with the generic release on these, understanding that there's going to be some decent price erosion, but it's going to impact a high number of utilizing members as well. Just one important thing to consider with that is we're going to start to see some of these hit the market in 2025, but you might not see that price erosion immediately. So it'll be important to kind of focus on that. These generics have what's called a 180-day exclusivity period. That can sometimes only be one manufacturer who gets that. Sometimes it can be a few. But basically that's 6 months that one or maybe just a couple manufacturers are allowed to produce that drug. And because there's decreased competition there, you'll see a decrease in cost from the brand price, but really not going to see that steep price erosion until after that 6 month period when more are hitting the market.
And to add to that, I would say this calls out, again, the importance on using data to manage your plan. And this is the advice I would give for plan sponsors out there, is to understand your own spend, because some of these high impact specialty drugs may not always show up in a overall trend report or when you're looking across a book of business. And the same goes, a lot of PBMs, they manage their clinical criteria based on their entire book. So it's not always specific to individual plan sponsors, which is why it's so important for them to understand their spend and best serve their patient population.
And it's why the work that you all do is also so important. So you've given a ton of great information, but I know we've kind of just scratched the surface. I know you all are working on a number of different reports coming up, but for our audience, what I would encourage you to do, not only are we proud to have Prism as a partner on the Granite List, but you all also produce a fabulous LinkedIn newsletter on these topics and many, many more called Jake's Takes. So audience, I highly encourage you, go to LinkedIn, find Prism Health Group, sign up for that newsletter. And guys, I really appreciate you being on today's show.
Thank you, Sally. We appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And thank you to our audience for tuning in to another episode of the Granite List Live.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Granite List Live. Access our entire library by visiting your favorite podcast venue or subscribe on our site, thegranitelist.live.